Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs Daily War Room Update. We're on day number 110 of the war with the terrorists in Gaza, and really everything is continuing on according to the Israeli plan. The targets for the war that was set by Israel's war cabinet were to destroy Hamas's governance capabilities and to destroy their terror infrastructure, and that's the program that's being implemented on the ground. In the northern Gaza Strip, IDF forces have destroyed most of the terrorist forces there and are now just really consolidating that hold, destroying more and more tunnels, more and more tunnel entrances every day, and more of these factories of Hamas to really build their own weapons. They're extending also the operations into the central and southern areas of the Gaza Strip, also into Nuseirat, into Khan Yunis, which is really one of the strongholds of Hamas. Many tunnels, many entrances to the tunnels in schools, in mosques, in nurseries, in every possible civilian environment that you could find. Today we had a very interesting incident in Deir al-Balach, one of the small areas of Gaza, where there was a spontaneous really demonstration by the Gazans against Hamas, calling for them to release all of the hostages that they continue to hold. 136 Israeli hostages are still being held in the hands of Hamas, and really now the Hamas really is getting to the point where even the Gazans are demanding that they release the hostages, let this war finish. They are feeling really that push of the force of the Israeli military operations. At the same time, Israel is also facilitating and pushing even beyond the capabilities of the UN and the other organizations, humanitarian aid into the southern area of the Gaza Strip, coming through Egypt via checks done by Israel and the Egyptians, and then going into the Gaza Strip. That's something which Israel has put really quite an important stress on, to make sure that there isn't, to the extent possible, too much of a humanitarian crisis developing in that area, and in general making sure that there's water, that there's fuel, that there's food, really everything going in that the population needs in order to continue on surviving. What we haven't seen, despite the fact that 9 days have already passed, is any type of recognition of the fact that the medicine that Israel allowed in last week has actually reached the hostages and was given to the hostages. This was something which had to happen. The Qataris were meant to provide evidence that the medicines that Israel specifically let in for the hostages actually reached them and didn't just go to for the care of the Hamas fighters. But unfortunately, that's something that we haven't seen. Another humanitarian move that the homicidal, genocidal terrorists could have actually implemented, but they've decided not to, really as part of their propaganda, their terror propaganda, to ensure that Israel, the hostages, the families of the hostages are consistently left in this status of not knowing what's going on at all. Have their loved ones received care, not received care? Maybe they'll receive some medicines that they need, and maybe they just won't. That is part of that terrorist strategy. In the north, we've continued on seeing the same war of attrition continuing on. Hezbollah fires rockets, anti-tank weapons, destroying much of the Israel's presence in the northern border. In the meantime, 100,000 Israelis have been expelled from their homes, but that war continues on. To date, 163 terrorists from Hezbollah being killed. Today, on that subject, an interesting, almost interesting, what could have been an interesting understanding, that suddenly, before any type of political arrangement can be reached with the Lebanese need to appoint, elect, whatever it may be, a president, a government. They haven't had any of these for over a year. But in the meantime, the Biden administration representative, Amos Hochstein, has been running between Beirut and Israel, trying to persuade Israel to accept the terms of the terrorists Hezbollah, even though Lebanon doesn't really have any type of government or any type of other partner who could really enforce any type of agreement that they're suggesting. They're suggesting implementing UN Security Council Resolution 1701 from the end of the Second Lebanon War, which says that Hezbollah must be disbanded, the militias must be disbanded, all of the terrorists must move wherever they are, north of the Litani River, and the Lebanese army must move into the south. How can anyone legitimately expect that to be implemented when there's no one to talk to? And so that's a question that's obviously going on. From our south, the Houthis are continuing on with their aggression and interruption of the freedom of navigation. Open brackets. Apparently, they know exactly who the targets they're targeting are. They know that they're not targeting Chinese ships. They know that they're not targeting Russian ships. There are the ships that are allowed to move freely through Bab el-Manda and up through the Red Sea towards the Suez Canal. And then there is the terrorism of the Houthis, who are an Iranian proxy, only on the shipping through Europe and to Israel. That's their idea, to cause as much damage as possible, also to Europe. And everyone should understand that this is part of Iran's war on Europe as much as it is Iran's war on Israel. In Judea and Samaria, we're seeing still the continuation of the terror there as well. The same terrorist organizations, Hamas, PFLP, Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades, run by Mahmoud Abbas, the so-called moderate, all of those terrorist organizations continuing on with their efforts also to promote terror. And obviously what we were discussing 2 days ago, I was in the Knesset, Israel's parliament, discussing a law that would provide really heightened punitive damages against any organization, the PLO, the PA, that pays salaries to terrorists in favor of victims of terror. The idea simply being, well, if you've got enough money to pay terrorists, then you can also pay the victims of terror. But in that context, everyone's talking about, well, what about the PA? Where is the PA? What's the PA's part in this? Who is going to be the next part of Gaza? What is going to happen in Gaza? But the question that we need to be asking ourselves is, who is this? And we discussed this yesterday also extensively with Yoni Ben Menachem. Who is that Palestinian side? Who are we talking to? Who does Mahmoud Abbas represent when 80% of Palestinians want him to resign? 80% of Palestinians support Hamas and the October 7 massacre. So if we're talking about a two-state solution, who's on that other side? And behind all the scenes, we have nonetheless this push for Palestinian statehood and this undermining of Israel's basic rights, sometimes the basic right to self-defense. And that brings us to our special guest for today, Olga Deutsch, the vice president of NGO Monitor, someone who's been really investigating and exposing this entire NGO network that's working on behalf of promoting the idea of delegitimizing Israel on the one hand, and claiming and really taking over this idea of human rights and imposing them only, or applying them only to the human rights of the Palestinians, and negating any type of Jewish human rights, including even as Francesca Albanese, the UN Human Rights Council Special Rapporteur for the occupied Palestinian territories, as they're called, who has said that Israel doesn't even have a basic right of self-defense. This is all being fed by extensive discussion by NGOs on behalf of the Palestinians, to Israel's detriment. Every type of libel that you can think of. The idea of Israel as an apartheid state, it didn't start necessarily anywhere but the NGOs. Israel is committing a genocide. It started with the NGOs. Everything that you can really think of has started there. And then this ability of these organizations to turn those libels into lawfare, into attacks on Israel all over the globe. Olga, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Maurice.
Give us a little bit of an idea. I saw the NGO Monitor, for anyone who doesn't know, NGO Monitor, you should go onto the website, look it up, great material. Give us a little bit of idea of the reports that the NGO Monitor put out now, explaining the involvement of the different NGOs, some of them ostensibly respectable NGOs, in this whole claim of South Africa in the ICJ against Israel?
Well, I think it's important to even zoom out before we zoom in, right, and talk about the ICJ and South Africa's claim, to zoom out a bit and sort of look at the trends in the last 20 years. Basically, we have a situation that was emulgated and sort of culminated in the aftermath of the October 7th massacre, where the entire human rights community completely failed us, right? Failed the Israeli victims, Jews, and but not only Jews, and it 100% completely failed Jews globally, right? And there were en masse demonstrations and anti-Semitic attacks, physical violence against Jews, and no one was neither defending nor advocating for us. But it's even worse than that. It wasn't necessarily even acknowledged by the so-called human rights community. And NGO Monitor populates that space. We were created 20 years ago by Professor Gerald Steinberg in the aftermath of the infamous Durban conference, right, in South Africa, the UN conference, that in parallel to the official one, there was the NGO summit. That's why I want to go all the way back. Yeah. And it was the NGOs that basically revamped the Zionism is racism claim and made it a central quasi-human rights issue. And ever since then, we are seeing an exponential sort of escalation in the discourse. So it started with Zionism is racism, then there was a whole talk about just the occupation. Was it the 67 line? There was a matter of products and boycotting products. First they spoke about boycotting products that were produced behind the 67th line, right? Then it went broader than that. Then we had a whole discourse of one-state solution, return of the refugees. But in the recent years, and in parallel to seeing actually a complete geopolitical change in the region, and this was pretty much in parallel to the signing of the Abraham Accord agreements, that community felt that they also had to up their game, so to speak. So as a response to the Abraham Accords, they launched the apartheid campaign. So they felt that the attack against Israel had to go that much stronger.
So as Israel expanded its relations with the Arab countries, more peace with the Arab countries, we became more of an apartheid state.
Exactly. And we see, and the main propagators of all these campaigns, and some of them all of them boil down to an ongoing political warfare, right, against Israel, but many are manifested through lawfare or the abuse of legal systems and legal frameworks. And in the aftermath of October the 7th, we saw an additional escalation where, on top of the apartheid claims, we saw accusations of genocide, ethnic cleansing, and so on. And zooming in now on the lawfare, right, or the abuse of legal systems and the international law, and it all led us to ICJ, right? A couple of weeks ago, we had an array of NGOs file actual lawsuits against states. Al-Haq, the biggest and the most prominent Palestinian NGO, together with DCIP and another American NGO, filed a lawsuit against Biden and his administration and urged the administration to prevent Israel from committing genocide. And as a derivative of that, called for stopping all arms deal and all aid to Israel. Then another group of NGOs filed a similar lawsuit against the Dutch government, calling for the government to stop its export of F-35 jets to Israel, and a similar lawsuit in the UK. So we see a pattern here, and each time...
But we have to just open brackets 1 second. Al-Haq and DCI Palestine, Defense of the Children International Palestine, they've taken that name of this international organization that's quite well regarded and well seen, but really they are just arms of the PFLP. They're arms of the Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine. They're designated terrorist organization. They act on their behalf. I have a long relationship, a prior relationship with them.
Yeah.
For whatever reason it is, mostly because they were there funding and helping the PFLP when its terrorists murdered Rina Schnurb in 2019. And so these are the people who are suing Israel around the world. It's terrorist arms that are suing Israel for attacking their friends in Gaza.
That's exactly the problem. But if that weren't enough, if it were just a bunch of groups, right? Because terror groups abuse charities and non-governmental organizations all the time, right? Because this is probably the easiest to abuse because they are the least regulated, right? But what we have something that is pretty unique here, which is that most of these groups are actually supported financially, but not only. And I always emphasize that, I cannot emphasize that enough, because the financial support is just one aspect. And to my mind, even sometimes it's a grant of $20,000, and that's not an existential support. But if a terror-affiliated NGO can put the emblem of the German federal government or the United Nations or the EU, right, or USAID, the US government, on its activity, on its brochure, that is actually that much worse, because it gives it the legitimacy as if they were supported with everything that they do and everything they stand for by that government. And the situation that we find ourselves uniquely when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a systemic abuse of human rights and humanitarian structures propagated by the NGOs, who claim to promote human rights and humanitarian causes, but in practice, while supported through official governmental programs, they promote anti-Semitism, they incite to violence, dehumanize Israelis, and in many cases have bona fide ties to terror groups. At the end of the day, the situation that we found ourselves in, that after October the 7th, no one in the Palestinian society condemned the massacre. Not only the ones that proactively perpetrated, and it's worth mentioning over and over again that it wasn't just Hamas, it was also Islamic Jihad and PFLP. Although many Europeans regard them as half-dormant terror group, they are not. They have taken credit and pride in being part of the atrocities. But they have, in parallel to the physical violence and the physical terror, right, that each of these groups, they have their physical terror arms, they have the so-called NGO arm, which has over the decades radicalized systemically the Palestinian society. They dehumanized Israelis by calling us systematically colonizers, soldiers, right, occupiers, and so on.
All of the buzzwords.
All of the buzzwords, sort of not making us human. So when October the 7th happens, then the Palestinian people don't necessarily have a relationship feeling that actual people were victims. And they educated generations of Palestinians who base their entire identity surrounding what Israel does, Israeli occupation, and hate, right?
Yeah.
And their national identity that is only relevant if it comes to replace us. Because if before October the 7th we would talk about where does legitimate criticism of Israel end and anti-Semitism begins, where anti-Israel discourse is anti-Semitism, where it's not, I think October the 7th sort of changed all that. And
made it very clear that there are two sides here. There is the anti-Zionism, as it were, and then there's anti-Semitism, and then there's the inability to even see the Jews as humans and to identify with the massacre. I think that's taken to a different level entirely.
And I think the lowest common denominator is even lower now after October the 7th. It's literally, you either recognize Israel's right to exist as a Jewish homeland, regardless of its borders, because the borders are a political dispute, right? But you either recognize its right to exist or you don't. And if you don't, then you're an anti-Semite. There's no other way of calling that. And not surprisingly, back to your original question, what we saw in The Hague, right, during the ICJ hearing, South Africa's presentation, is a number of NGO representatives, including Shawana Jabarin, the Secretary General of Al-Haq, right? And
He was there?
he was there physically. Someone from Al-Mazan, another PFLP affiliated organization, was also there. The legal advisor of Al-Haq, who also consulted South Africa in writing the case, was also there. Susan Powers, Power, exactly, who tweeted right after October the 7th, saying that basically international humanitarian law defends Palestinian right to resist. Now she leaves
in other words, as a lawyer of a human rights organization, she said that the terrorists that invaded Israel butchered, murdered, raped, pillaged, behead children, men, women, everything, took the heads of soldiers and then tried to sell them for $10,000. That was, in her eyes, as a representative of an accredited Friends with the Europeans human rights organization, that in her eyes was perfectly legitimate.
So, typically she leaves all that out, but she doesn't say it's to resist is within the right of the international humanitarian law, except for physical violence and terror and murder. But by doing that, for most people just reading her tweet on the go, that's what it is. It sort of normalizes what Hamas did. And that is, I guess that's a summary. That's the best way to summarize the entire campaign against Israel. And we see it across the policy areas, and the lawfare is just one, and maybe the most prominent because it just catches the media's attention and our attention, because it also potentially might have physical ramifications against Israeli citizens, Israeli politicians, and so on. Not the ICJ one, but the ICC one, right?
Yeah.
Depending on what might happen.
They've been very active also in the ICC, putting in complaints since the start of the war,
yeah.
pushing the prosecutor Karim Khan to widen the investigation against Israel for all types of alleged crimes. This has been a major part of their strategy.
Major part. That it's the NGO, and it's the same NGOs that are basically behind creating the United Nations Commission of Inquiry, which was the first step that was supposed to create a legal precedent, right, ahead of the case at the International Criminal Court in The Hague. Then it is them meeting with the prosecutor, filing submissions, all accusing Israel of apartheid, of systemic violations, of the gravest violations of the human rights and humanitarian law you can think of. Speaking of Al-Haq, last summer they filed an official submission to the United Nations, actually accusing Israel, and I kid you not, this one cannot make this up, of systematically stealing water as a natural resource that belongs to the indigenous Palestinian people. And as a proof, they actually stated the creation of the Zionist movement 125 years ago. They stated the creation of Israel, the creation of different infrastructural national institutions, including Mekorot, the public water company that, by the way, supplies the Palestinians with water as well. And in that submission, they even made a nonsensical claim that Theodor Herzl, when he created Zionism, he basically, instead of dealing with the increasing anti-Semitism in Europe and talking to the heads of states in Europe, he went on to create this racist movement to steal the indigenous land of the Palestinian people. So, but when you, like any lie and in propaganda, when you repeat it thousands of times, and then when it's emphasized by the media, and these groups are quoted in the leading media publications, and then the same organizations are quoted by Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, and then it becomes a reality.
That's
that
one
we have
of
to
the
face.
ability of the NGOs that are attacking Israel to cross quote each other. That they're constantly referring one to the other's report, therefore giving it almost this halo of legitimacy, as if I repeat the same lie that someone else is talking about, then it really becomes that truth. Did they mention anything about the fact that Israel is a world leader in desalination and the water also goes to the Palestinians?
No, of course not. And
something about Israel providing water to Jordan, maybe that they wouldn't have water without us.
Of course, none of that. And it's more than that. Most of these groups, right after October the 7th, they either completely ignored what happened or relativized it.
Excuse me interrupting, Olga. How many of these so-called human rights organizations that receive support from the European countries specifically condemned the October 7 massacre?
None.
None of them?
None.
And what do the European funders have to say about that?
So that's actually an excellent question, because if this topic was difficult before October the 7th, because it's not an easy job to come to policymakers and say, hey, the same groups that you've been partnering with for the last 30 years are actually
terrorists in suits.
Exactly. But I do believe that October the 7th changed something also in the paradigm. The window of opportunity is narrow and is closing down on us, obviously, across the board, right? Not only on this issue, but there is a slight shift in paradigm, because I do think that the magnitude of the atrocities of October the 7th shook at least most of the Europeans to their core, and at least in certain countries. It's mostly the case in Germany, for example, and in UK to a certain extent, and in several other countries in Europe, where the policymakers are saying, well, maybe we do need to vet these groups better. Maybe we do need to control them a little bit more, because until now the approach was almost apologetic. It was almost sort of saying, well, it's part of the national ethos to hate the Jews a little bit, and
a little bit, a lot,
a lot. And we do see an opportunity and an appetite to talk about this, but with an actual ask, what to do. And I think that sort of leads us into this huge question of the day after. But most people focus on how Gaza will look like the day after physically, and there's a huge question, and we believe that it is a central one to what the day after looks like for the international donor community. Only the United Nations asked for $1.2 billion in humanitarian aid, most of which goes through NGOs and to NGOs in one way or the other, only to Gaza, only for the last quarter of 2023. Meaning, so if you do a conservative...
When was that request made?
Just now, like in the last month, because the way it functions, the UN sort of makes an appeal to the member states, and its member states is the 30 most developed states, right? And then they pool the funds, and then the United Nations distribute them. When we are not in the war, then the states also do that directly, and through their local groups and so on, and through local groups in their countries who work with groups here. But now the reality is different because of the war and because everything is so sensitive. So it is done through the UN. But if we are to do a very conservative math here, estimate, and say that they would need a similar amount quarterly for 2024, that's an insane amount. That's a lot of money. Now, unless the donor community starts the conversation of how are we going to better control where it goes, and how that money is not diverted to terror.
Are they already thinking now about how to ensure that the money that goes into Gaza after the war doesn't go to digging terror tunnels, doesn't go to preparing factories to make armaments, doesn't go to fund that whole machine of murder that was created in Gaza, and that could most probably come back in one way or another if Israel doesn't maintain its security presence there?
Well, there's no yes or no answer to that, like most things in politics and like most things in the Middle East. But immediately after the massacre of October the 7th, literally in the first 10 days, many countries, EU, Germany, Finland, Denmark, Sweden, Austria, Switzerland, froze all their funding to Palestinians, except for some of them completely, like Austria, and some of them, all of it except for humanitarian aid, because they understood that something's went terribly wrong. And they commissioned their respective ministries or aid agencies to run internal investigations to make sure to check basically whether any money went to Hamas or to anyone who doesn't condemn the massacre. Now, most of them found that no money went to Hamas, but I have to
Clearly,
I mean, that is almost funny, right? I mean,
clearly the money went to Hamas. Hamas wasn't able to dig these massive tunnels. One of the claims that these NGOs constantly make is that Gaza was under a blockade, and yet they were able to bring in massive engineering equipment to dig 20-meter deep tunnels and tunnels that you could pass trucks through. This is serious construction,
and it's a catch-22 because number one, the physical material, construction material needed to build the tunnels only went into Gaza through humanitarian aid, right? And monitored by
these reconstruct Gaza efforts every time.
Exactly. At the same time, for example, the EU list, the EU terror list, what we refer to as the EU terrorist, is basically the EU list of restrictive measures, because it is a list of organizations and individuals against which the EU can undertake financial restrictive measures, close their accounts, confiscate goods, raid their offices, and so on and so on. For all the terror groups around the world, next to the name of the group, there would be a list of individuals, right? Because you have to figure out who are the leaders of these terror groups and against whom you are operating, except for the Palestinian terror groups. His name escaped me. It's like Amman. I don't want to. The Hamas leader who was just added to that list. Exactly. He was the first Palestinian individual by name and family name that was added to the list. What does that mean in practice? That means that Leila Khaled, right, 2016, right, marches into the European Parliament in Brussels and in front of a full room of people gets standing ovations when she says, well, the situation of the Israeli occupation is so grave that there's absolutely nothing else we can do. I suggest we hijack another plane. Now that is clear.
Open brackets, Leila Khaled, member of the PFLP, Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine, terrorist, was involved in hijacking aeroplanes in the 1970s. She's been a terrorist now for 50 years.
And that's common knowledge.
And the PFLP is a designated terrorist organization by the EU. It's on the list of restrictive measures. So she shouldn't have been there to start.
But the EU said, we have no legal grounds to restrict her in any way because her name is not on it. And so on one hand, they checked if any aid was diverted to Hamas, but obviously they were not going to find that. I mean, there's no receipt that any of it went to Hamas. And part of the challenge is that it is that much more sophisticated and that's much more complicated. Now, the physical diversion of aid is one aspect, and we have seen so many proof of stealing UNRWA
fuel and everything
and using their premises and so on. But there's a whole different aspect, which is just the incitement, constant incitement, and propagating hate. That is sort of the soft thing, and it is much more difficult to measure. And on that account, the European governments definitely do not have instruments in place and mechanisms in place to neither monitor, detect, identify what qualifies, what doesn't qualify as hate speech or denying Israel's. They don't. This terminology does not.
Even though there is extensive legislation in the EU and directives on the subject of terrorism, defining what is terrorism, what is glorification of terrorism, and outlawing that, it's really an offence. So there are those basic guidelines. They just don't apply them when it comes to the Palestinians.
Very much so. for example, during the last round with Gaza, right, in 2023, a Palestinian NGO issued a press release, and amongst other things said, Palestinians and Gaza people have the right to resist by all means, which basically just means terror, right? And of course, under the international humanitarian law and all the other schlagwords, like the buzzwords, right? And we exposed them for it, and we reached out to the few European donor governments, and the result was, yes, they were shocked and angry, but the result was that basically the NGO had to rewrite that line and take it out, and no other sanction took place. So not only do they not monitor for these kind of things, not only do they not when alerted to it, really act about it, but there's also no sanction mechanism, and there should be a very serious conversation, just like in any other line of work. Say that you steal, there's a limitation how long, or you have a criminal record, how long you cannot run, for example, for public office, right? Or certain things. There's absolutely none of that when we speak about NGOs. Now, oftentimes we are confronted with this, well, you guys are just right-wingers who want all NGOs shut down. And that is part of the challenge.
Surely, but on that question, surely there can't be any idea that all of the Palestinian NGOs are all terrorists. There are some legitimate NGOs that work, and they do the work, and that's it. It's just the terrorist organizations that have opened these front operations that are called NGOs. They're the problem.
Well, I wouldn't know, right? Because we don't hear from any of these NGOs. I think there's also there's a lot of propaganda and bullying in the Palestinian, so to speak, civil society as well. If you don't sign off on the BDS campaign, I don't think you can really be a Palestinian NGO, no matter what you're doing. And that's
part of the Palestinian idea and the control that the Palestinian Authority has over all of those civil society organizations.
Exactly. And also internationally, these groups, right, that are very violent and very anti-Israel and very many of them terror affiliated, they are the most vocal ones, and they are here again. This is to me at least the worst part. They're the main European and counterparts and partners, and that's the problem. And I believe that unless we sort of build on the horrors of October the 7th, right, and use the momentum created internationally to say there's got to be a serious recalibration of how European and other governments work with Palestinians in general, but we speak about NGOs specifically now. Yeah. And sanctions when they are, when they do something wrong or say something hateful or insightful, then we're just going to find ourselves in a situation after the war where the political pressure to rebuild and restructure will be so immense. Billions of dollars will be flowing into Gaza, but not only Gaza, right? Because they will want to rebuild the PA or whatever comes after, and there will be absolutely no mechanisms to check.
So on a separate but almost, I would believe, connected note, one of the international organizations that has really completely failed the Palestinians for 75 years, has failed Israel, has really eternalized this idea of Palestinian refugeeship and victimhood, is UNRWA. Really a completely disastrous organization from start to finish. They, a while ago, the head of the organization left in questionable circumstances, and has just recently been appointed as the CEO of the Red Cross. And so Israel has been asking the Red Cross, well, why aren't you helping more to deal with Israel's hostages that are being held by the terrorist organizations? They've completely disappeared, and are not fulfilling any of their functions whatsoever, apart from pushing Israel to allow them access to these terrorists who beheaded and raped and murdered. And now we're going to see the same people in charge of the Red Cross. Is this something that we should be worried about? Is it something that is going to bring about a change? Could it get any worse in the Red Cross?
Well, I mean, we call it revolving doors, right? Like it's a part of that, part of the so almost a closed community where the UN agencies operating on the ground, UNRWA being the biggest and probably the most important one with the biggest network and outreach and presence on the ground, works together with all these NGOs. So they know each other and they go from one job to another within the same industry. We should definitely be worried by it. Many of us in this line of work of fighting anti-Semitism for a living, right? And dealing with delegitimization and attacks against Israel day in, day out, until October the 7th, one could even ask, are we perpetuating part of the problem because we keep talking about it? But at least to me, after October the 7th, there's no denying that we have the state, but it is under a threat, and not only physically.
Yeah.
And I'm less worried about its physical well-being, because that's the difference. We have an army, but the ongoing and ever escalating in the narrative, right? Political campaign in the global political climate, which...
And that's exactly it. These NGOs that are attacking Israel constantly aren't only attacking Israel and undermining and delegitimizing Israel, they're providing the basis, also obviously a fundamentally wrong but educational basis to those people around the world on student campuses. Students read these reports that are put out by ostensibly legitimate and respectable organizations. They trust them. They put value on what these organizations say, and they are feeding into this whole mechanism of hatred against Israel. That's one of the things that really we do have to get into a little bit more. Unfortunately, our time is now over, and so we'll have to continue on another time. Just for those of you who are joining us, again, thank you for joining us for today's briefing. For other briefings, you can follow our briefings either through the Zoom link that we post on our website, on the JCPA website, and is also spread around on social media, or on our YouTube channel. You can get to that also through the website of the JCPA. And really, you're more than welcome to join us every day. Just a word, tomorrow, as an irregular thing, we do not have a briefing tomorrow afternoon. Tomorrow, the JCPA is participating together with the Bitonistim in a conference discussing Israel's security situation. JCPA President Dr. Dan Diker will be running a special session on Iran and Iran's tentacles around the world. I will be participating in a panel discussing what's going to be happening in Gaza the day after the war. Where is that all going? Not from the NGO point of view, but really from the UN and Palestinian Authority point of view. Who is going to be there and running Gaza? You'll be able to join that also. It's only in Hebrew, I'm afraid, but also through our website, I hope, and through our social media. We will, if there is an update on that, and there will be, sometimes there will be a simultaneous translation, so that will also be possibly available. The conference is from 9 in the morning till 2 o'clock in the afternoon Israel time, so I'm afraid for our audience in America, it may be a little bit early, but you're definitely invited to join us. Otherwise, we will be back on Sunday with you, and we will start another week of the briefings, providing really that discussion. There is, as I mentioned in the introduction, some discussion that the decision of the ICJ regarding South Africa's interim requests for injunctions against Israel to stop the war, to give up fighting against the genocidal terrorists, and to really give up on our right to self-defense. That decision is possibly going to be handed down on Friday. So on Sunday, we'll obviously be discussing that as well. Until then, thank you for joining us again. Stay safe, everyone, and we will see you next week. Olga, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.